Hello, and welcome to the podcast. Now, you may remember that in our last podcast before Christmas, Sir Richard Eyre, former BBC Governor and Director of the National Theatre, launched an impassioned attack on the BBC's coverage of the arts. Well, on Wednesday this week, The Times published a letter signed by around 200 leading writers, actors and producers, condemning Radio 3's decision to scrap drama on the network. Meanwhile, the BBC's Executive Complaints Unit published a damning verdict on Radio Devon's failure to cover adequately last summer's riots, though it didn't publish it very widely. BBC Local Radio has been experiencing ongoing cuts since autumn 2022, in response to a reduction in real terms of BBC funding by 38% since 2010. Now, as a consequence, more programmes have been shared between local radio stations, but they all still have dedicated programming between 6 a.m. and 2 p.m. on weekdays. Some stations share regional programmes on weekday afternoons and on weekends, but at the weekends, all 39 stations still produce and air their own live and local bulletins. The BBC insists that recent changes are not so much cuts as redeployment of resources to digital, where it believes younger audiences in particular are to be increasingly found. So, how did these local stations fare last summer when riots, which started in Stockport, spread across the UK, including to Rotherham, Middlesbrough, Bolton, Belfast and Plymouth? To discuss this answer, I'm delighted to be joined by David Lloyd, who has worked for over 40 years in radio, from LBC to Virgin to BBC Local Radio. He's also had regulatory experience from his years at the UK Radio Authority, that's now part of Ofcom. He's now a broadcaster and co-founder of the relatively new UK station for baby boomers, Boom Radio. David Lloyd, welcome to the podcast. What made you complain or want to complain about Radio Devon's coverage?
I've been very concerned about BBC Local Radio, particularly since the changes with more and more networking and the stations becoming regional for more of the day. And at the stage that the BBC were given permission to do that by the variation of the operating licence, there were assurances from the BBC that in times of crisis, local crisis, those stations, even if they were networked, will be really well equipped to rise to the occasion. And, that's where local radio really comes into its own. So I have been listening over the months to see if they have risen to the occasion. And I've submitted a number of complaints saying, actually, I don't think you have. And I've looked, as you know, with this complaint about local unrest, but I've looked at flooding and local mayoral appointments and such things, just to see how those local stations fared at those times. My conclusion is they didn't fare very well. I've submitted a number of complaints, and this is the one that's actually gone right the way through the very lengthy BBC complaints process to a very sensible, very fair, measured, objective analysis by the Executive Complaints Unit.
Well, it says, I might as well read it, Complaints Director Jonathan Greenwood said, "I have to infer from my investigations that there were elements of systemic failure on the night of the 5th of August, that's 2024 last year when the riots were going on, because the staff on duty did not respond adequately to this significant breaking news, either due to lack of training or clear enough instruction." What's your view of those two things?
I think that's a damning verdict of a broadcaster which is charged with high quality broadcasting. When he goes on to talk about staff holidays, well, those excuses just don't wash. They really don't. I hear about broadcasters not being available for service because of the snow or whatever. That was never tolerated in my day. You were expected to be there. You were almost an emergency service. So I think that view of that is a lot is summarised in that sentence of trying to find out the reasons. Was it training? Was it availability? What was it? But they should be equipped to cope. And this is the thing, really.
But Jonathan, just to interrupt you there, Jonathan Greenwood says either one or the other, either due to a lack of training or clear enough instruction. Do you know which one it's likely to have been, or both?
I think it's both of those, plus the availability of the right people at that moment. You can't demolish an operation, which is what's happened at BBC Local Radio. Staff have changed, been made redundant. The staff there aren't the same staff as before. Times like this, the person you want on the radio in every city is someone who knows that patch instinctively, knows its people, and is equipped to perform the really delicate job of putting its arm around the community, saying the right reassuring things to often, certainly at night, a more vulnerable, older audience, and saying the right thing and blending that accurate news. The information must be accurate, but there's also a reassurance and comfort. And it doesn't mean you've got to talk exclusively about the challenge. It's just that you've got to be knowledgeable about it. And when people turn on, they know pretty quickly that you're going to be talking about whatever's on their mind. And that's the job of a very accomplished broadcaster. And those two things, really. First of all, those broadcasters are, many of them aren't there anymore, so the BBC has to scurry around to find them. And also, because of the changes, the audiences to this output will be severely diminished anyway.
You see, what's I mean, the obvious point, two obvious points. One is, in the past, if something like this had happened, these riots or whatever, whether you were on call or not, or home or holiday, you come in off your holiday, you just race in, wouldn't you? That's the first thing. Well, either people don't want to do that anymore, or they weren't there to race in. The second thing is the failure to understand that, it's like traffic jams when you're sitting in the motorway for 3 hours, or riots like this are precisely the moment when people go to local radio, and if they find that it's covering well and offers them something which no one else does, they stay. But if they go and they find nothing, they don't bother to come again. This is presumably the big worry, that the failure is not just on big moments, but it's the consequence of those failures on what, if you like, the attitude generally of the community to their so-called local radio.
It is. I've run local radio stations before, and times like this, although it's very difficult for the people involved, actually it gives your station a fillip that you can then play to your advantage because you're able to showcase who you are and what you do. So exactly, it's more valuable beyond that night. But I think the BBC's Executive Complaints Unit judgment was very fair in that it looked not only at the limited quantity of information, it looked at the overall programme. Because, OK, you might have a 20-second insert at 20 past, which may bring you up to date with the news headline. But if, when you tune in right at the beginning of the hour or just up to the hour when they're previewing what's happened, if you're not assured at that stage the station is going to be holding your hand through that night, you won't stay with it. You've no idea there's going to be the information scattered in. And I think the Executive Complaints Unit really highlighted that fairly.
I mean, they did spell it out. They said there was little sense of what was happening and little evidence of the BBC having a presence on the scene. Radio Devon listeners would have no sense throughout the evening that the station had a reporter at or near where the trouble was taking place. BBC Radio Devon's management recognised that the story should have been covered better, and there is an acknowledgement that the resources and response required on this occasion were underestimated. Now, if this had happened in the past, someone would have been fired, actually, for that. I mean, BBC doesn't like, put it this way in BBC, to redeployed or even promoted, but got out of the way. There's no attempt here to suggest that any form of disciplinary action is required, which presumably means that the people answering the complaint recognise that BBC Devon's management were in a tough corner anyway, that the resources and response together were underestimated. This assumes that the resources were available to be deployed. And I think your argument is that they weren't there to be deployed anyway. So it's not a question so much of underestimating a situation, although that might be party to it. It is, even if you estimated it correctly, you don't then have the resources to deal with it. Is that latter point yours?
It is. The resources, although the BBC gave Ofcom an assurance when the licence was changed that they would be able to respond, it's not clear that they are. And in the same way, during routine programming in the afternoon, now shared afternoon shows, they say we're going to carry reports and information about all the patch, the bigger patch, just like we do in our 6 o'clock news. But they don't. Actually, what they do is talk about very little. I'm not decrying the quality of what's there, but it's actually not about any of the patch. So they're not equipped to do the job. And the most concerning thing, or one of the most concerning things about this outcome, is that the BBC have learnt lessons and done all the things that people say in situations like this.
Oh, yeah, made adjustments to our ways of working is the one they used in this case.
But when I submitted my complaint through the labyrinthine BBC complaints process, the first response from the shop floor was that we're all right, fine, everything was fine. Now, they didn't say, actually, let's look into that. No, we need to think about this and we'll come back to you. No, it's all fine. So they had to be told that it wasn't fine. Now, I don't want to get at BBC Radio Devon. I'm using them because the BBC complaints process doesn't make it easy for me to make broad comments about the broader issue. So I'm highlighting this. And there are some excellent people working at Radio Devon who tried their very best, probably on that night, who didn't want to be there, who were there doing their very best. I don't want to decry those efforts. But this is an example of how BBC Local Radio, in its new form, is unable to deliver proper local radio.
Well, when we've tasked in the past and when I was on feedback, we talked about the resources devoted to local radio. The argument was put, no, we're not making cuts financially. We are redistributing resources. It's always difficult with opaque BBC finances to be absolutely sure. But in terms of the way in which their online operation operated in Devon, there was criticism there because it says that there was no dedicated live coverage online of the Plymouth riot, nor enough updates posted on the big social media platforms. And on the latter score, quote, more would have been done had it not been for staff leave. So even in online, where the resources are supposed to be, and whether or not you think that's adequate anyway, there are failings online too. Of course, the background to all of this are quite significant falling audiences across England's local radio. How serious do you think that is? I mean, I've seen reports which say that BBC Local Radio in England has lost almost a third of its listeners in 3 years. Now, you can say, on the one hand, that demonstrates the BBC's right to switch to online. On the other hand, you could say, if you cut resources to what people know and love, they start to switch off. Where are you?
Well, I think the BBC can do a lot better on the resources available, even as reduced. I mean, they've still got £120 million now, furnishing a lot of very part-time radio stations. That's a lot of money. In other hands, that could actually deliver some incredible local radio, which suggests is the BBC the right person to be running local radio if it really takes them that much money to deliver it poorly. So I think that's one thing.
Well, sorry, you're suggesting that as we look at the BBC Charter in the future, there should be a serious discussion about providing local radio of a type that the BBC does or used to produce, but having some other body responsible for it.
It's certainly something that should be looked at. You've been in this business a long time, Roger. You'll remember that the BBC was dragged reluctantly and belatedly into local radio in the first place. And I'm sure if you spoke to a few managers over the years, they will say head office really doesn't get local radio. And there are some excellent community radio stations now. There are some that are not so excellent, but there are some excellent ones who are doing an incredible job on very little resource because they're looking at it in a contemporary way, looking at the technical facilities that are available, responding with great agility. So I think they could do it, they could do the job on the available budget now as reduced and less.
So the suggestion is that in the discussion about the future of public service broadcasting when the BBC Charter is renewed, an essential element for you would be not just a discussion on what the BBC should do, so much as what others might also do in the public service area, and local radio would be one.
I think that has to be looked at. And in the Annan Committee report of 77, the thought of a local radio authority was floated, because local radio now is beyond local radio. It's local online channels, it's local audio on demand. There's a lot of local audio that is being created outside the BBC. The BBC are the people getting the significant public funding and nobody else is. That doesn't seem very fair to me, and I think as we start to try to address the local democracy deficit, some more creative ways could be found of deploying that significant amount of money. On your online point, the BBC says that we haven't taken away money, we just redeployed it to where people are now finding news. I don't deny that. We all know, because of the way we use news, that online is a good place for it. So we've shifted that money. But it doesn't take into account that people actually come to radio, and all the research I've ever seen, and the BBC's own research, suggests that people come to radio for particular reasons. And when you come to radio at 10 o'clock on a dark, upsetting night in Devon or wherever, reading an article online does not perform the same purpose. So chopping this to do that is wrong. I'm not saying you don't need more money in online. Maybe you do, and that can be found from wherever if the BBC seeks to do it. But why does it come from a service which is doing something very different? Now, the BBC will say, hey, look, our figures have gone up. Look at our online consumption. And that's because they are promulgating it more efficiently. We all know how easy it is to get hits for stories if we want them. Everybody's doing that at the moment. Is that the job of the BBC, to pursue numbers rather than quality and public value?
Well, some of your concerns are shared by MPs on the Public Accounts Committee, because in April 2024, they said they feared the cuts to local radio could, and I quote, reduce services for people who are older or less able to access digital online platforms. And also, it's interesting to see that in the last 3 years, BBC Local Radio has lost over a third of the DE listeners it enjoyed. So that idea that the BBC was very keen to promote of local radio being your friend, if you like, as well, a special relationship, somebody you can trust, that's clearly under threat. I mean, when I worked at the BBC, and it's 1,000 years ago when I was in management, but also when I was presenter and whatever, it was very clear to me that in the end, the BBC, for all it genuinely committed to moving output out of London, all the key and essential decisions were taken centrally and on the whole by people without local radio experience. And that even in news, people representing news prioritised the national bulletins. For as many years as I can remember, and perhaps going back to Frank Gillard, that great man, local radio at the centre has not had people in the room often when these key decisions are taken. Am I out of date on this? Is that your experience, that just as radio is outgunned by television, dramatically in many ways, so local radio is outgunned by everybody almost? Is that fair?
I think it is fair. I sometimes wonder to what extent the BBC understands or cares about radio generally these days. Again, there are some fine people I respect hugely working in radio, but I think they would agree sometimes they'll bump their heads against people above them who don't seem to get what radio is all about, this peculiar, wonderful medium of radio. So I think that's a good point. As far as localness is concerned, local radio is a very particular thing. It's almost difficult to describe what it is at best, but when you talk to local radio listeners, you find out really what it is, why they turn on, for that friendship and that companionship. That's what drives it.
Well, the BBC would also say, apart from their investment, obviously, in digital, they would say that they've put quite a lot of money into local news partnerships because they are concerned about what's happening at the local level. And now, would you just explain to me how that system is supposed to work and whether you think it is working?
There is a fund. Some funds have been made available by the BBC to fund other projects, and some of these are, to summarise it, really they are to give money to local areas to help scrutinise local democracy, councils and whatever. So there is a fund available, and there is a host, radio or TV or press title, that actually accommodates a journalist paid for by the BBC, but that journalist will provide information for local radio, local or anybody who wants it. As long as you're an accredited recipient, you can use that. And I think it's a really interesting model, because this is saying, what could this cash do if it's in somebody else's hands? And I've been involved with the local TV station in Nottingham, not Steve as chairman. I'm no longer chairman, but I was chairman. And we were, I think, the first ever local TV station to host one of these reporters. And what a great service they were giving to Nottingham. You know, there were certainly the people that I was paying attention to find out what was happening at my local council in Nottingham, which is, you know, of late a very interesting council to observe. So I think that is interesting. And of course, they are providing the guts of the journalism, but they're not having to pay for the carriage of transmission. You know, that's all paid for by the broadcasters. But it means that information is reaching a really broad audience, both BBC radio listeners and commercial radio listeners and community radio listeners.
Well, I think it was Lord Tony Hall's idea, so that seems to be one that anyway is worth pursuing.
Yeah, I mean, there are other elements to
Yeah,
that.
of course.
That sort of
Of
public
course. Just want to mention one other thing. A few weeks ago, or just before Christmas, I talked to the Guardian's former media editor, Jim Waterson, and he was trying to get going something called London Centric, which he's promoting. And I know London is notoriously difficult to cover. I have, a long time in the past, had a responsibility on the nationwide programme to trying to devise something that would cover London. I found London didn't exist. That is to say, the area included Dunstable to the north, virtually Brighton to the south. All people had in common were virtually the trains. So I always thought it was a nigh and impossible job. But do you think that something like that Jim Watson is talking about obviates or gets rid of the need for BBC to do something, or simply provides the necessary competition that we've always argued that public service media need? We don't want monopoly. You don't want, in a way, too much competition, but you do need competition. Would that be your view?
I'm not sure the BBC would rise to the competition. I mean, at the moment, you've got a lot of commercial stations now becoming networked for all sorts of very sound economic reasons. You know, you can't carry on with loss-making commercial radio stations forever in a changing economic climate and economic model. But at the very time you'd expect the BBC to be coming in to fill that gap, to say, OK, commercial radio now is not doing local. Here's the time to really provide a service. The BBC hasn't risen to that, so it's hardly likely to start competing. It's an open door at the moment. It could do it now. I think that's the important thing.
That's fundamentally the market failure argument, isn't it? And I know, you and I work both with BBC, and there have always been two impulses in the BBC, well, many, but two basic laws. One is the BBC is public service broadcasting. Whatever it does is right. It's public service, and we protect it and expand it. And then the other element has been, hold on, if commercial providers can do something better, we should seriously consider investing in other areas. It's difficult to get that conversation going. As part of the charter renewal debate, it's presumably, you think it pretty essential, the BBC doesn't simply say, we continue to do what we do, give us more money to do it better. But actually there's a wider debate, and the BBC's role may be not to operate in certain areas and to actually increase investment in others.
That would seem something that has to happen. You know, the BBC has been around a long while, but in radio, of course, commercial radio has only been there for half the BBC's life. You've gone from 19 commercial stations in the 70s to hundreds and hundreds now. So for the BBC to suddenly seek to dominate radio in the way it used to seems a bit odd, and to duplicate to the same extent seems a bit odd. Now, the BBC says that we should not just be about market failure, and I agree. We don't want a worthy BBC that is absolutely wonderful but nobody watches or listens to. Nobody's asking for that. But it needs to make sure that if there is market failure in an area where a service has been proven of worth, shouldn't the BBC make absolutely sure that is a priority for the money that they do have? It is, going back to your London example, it is a very expensive job. This is the issue, as we've found. Doing local journalism well in particular markets is a really expensive job. And actually, you've got to fund that somehow.
Except the technology helped. I remember a long time ago when I was up in BBC in Manchester in the Network Production Centre, we were doing an experiment called about Radio Wigan and Lee, for example. And I remember going on to look at that. It wasn't my responsibility, and thinking, This is really unfortunate, because on the one hand, you are demonstrating, when you do that pop-up effectively radio station, a real demand. And yet the BBC hasn't the money to, as it were, expand its local radio stations in the way it should. If Radio New worked, that it would work in other areas, and so on and so on. And the BBC didn't have the money. So it was stuck in a way. But technology has changed and helped that, hasn't it? Because you can do radio so much more cheaply. You don't need big offices. You don't need big studios, as long as you work it out. So on the one hand, technology is thought to threaten it. On the other hand, it allows you to operate, if you've got the journalist in place and if they know how to handle things and you have proper editorial supervision, you can actually provide a service much more cheaply than in the past. Your buck, in other words, could go much further.
It can. It's very easy for the BBC to say, well, our funding in real terms has gone down and down. Everybody nobs wisely and how challenging it is. But they are spending so much money on those radio stations that they really don't need. I don't know anyone in the commercial sector who could actually spend that much money if they tried. There are lots and lots of models now, and one of my ones is run by a good friend of mine, Carrie Jones, in Shaftesbury. It's a one-man band supported by volunteers. The amount of worth that single person radio station with those volunteers provides in that market is phenomenal. And you think, actually, that's just one person. Just imagine if that had a little bit more resource and was funded well. How much could that be replicated across the country? Because, Kerry uses all the latest technology and dexterity, and it uses AI sort of used with careful human invigilation. But he's right up there with technology, whereas the BBC has, in all fairness, you look at local radio, rolling that out technically has been an absolute nightmare because the BBC are way behind commercial radio and everywhere else in the way that they use technology. Commercial radio with all its separate ad breaks for separate areas and separate news bulletins fired, many of them, is really complicated to do. The BBC has really wrestled with even bringing its local radio stations together. It's only just about got there now. Their technology was not built with this in mind. It was very expensive technology which wasn't built with this in mind.
Finally, can I ask you about something you will consider, I think, to be an example of BBC imperialism? You set up Boom radio station of, I don't know how you describe it, but nostalgia, big personalities, anyway, successfully from nothing. And now the BBC has proposed a spin-off service to Radio 2, which you certainly think is similar. It's being looked into. When will you find out whether the BBC will be allowed to launch such a service, which presumably will cause you greater difficulty?
This has now ended up at Ofcom's door to make the decision as to whether the current plans from the BBC will be allowed to go ahead, certainly in terms of as are concerned, the Radio 2 spin-off. And that can take as long as 6 months, but it may be that we know something a little before that. So there's going to be another few uncertain moments for our operation. And clearly it's one I care deeply about. As Radio 2 and local radio changed, can understand BBC Radio 2 changing. I can't understand why local radio suddenly had to change its target audience. But we filled that gap. We rose to fill that gap and said, here's something for older listeners. And as we filled that gap, the BBC have now come back belatedly and done all the things that they may have done a few years ago, and we wouldn't have bothered setting up Boom Radio. So we are very upset about this. But it's an oldies radio station. How many commercial oldies radio stations? You've got so many to choose from. The BBC doesn't seem to have listened to very many of them.
Well, you see, on the other hand, I understand the BBC's position in one way. It basically is told you've got to give value for money to the people who are paying the licence fee. They have no choice. Pay licence fee. There's an audience. Why aren't you providing stuff for it? And by the way, you could do it at little cost because you've already got the investment. So the BBC would say it's us responding to the audience. As opposed to that, you've got people, private enterprise like yourself, risking their money and everything else, and feeling extremely irritated when you've established that there's a market and the BBC then, and effectively puts you out of it. I mean, if the BBC was to run this service, would Boom be able to continue?
We think there's a fundamental threat to our business. Our business relies wholly on advertising revenues connected directly with the amount of listening hours that our radio stations enjoy. So, there's clearly a small margin in a business, and if you take away 10, 20% of that audience, your revenues fall. And, we haven't got other businesses to rely on. We are just Boom Radio. So we're in a particularly vulnerable position, not least in the current economic climate. So that could be really bad news for us. It could certainly stop the development of other services we've got, like Boom Light, which services, those over 70, 75 with easy listening music, really distinctive services. So it's galling for the BBC to propose this. But going back to your sort of, universality argument, yes, the BBC has to do things that are, attract decent audience. But let's remember, 55 plus remains, despite all the changes, the area the BBC absolutely owns in just about all media. In radio, it has a majority of listening. Still, it has more listening than all the other hundreds of radio stations added together. It's 3 times the size of its largest competitor. So, to use the argument the BBC should be out there serving the audience, it already is, and then some. Why isn't it putting more effort in other areas where the BBC is not reaching so specifically, and Ofcom's made clear where those areas should be?
David Lloyd, thank you very much indeed for talking to us.
Thank you, Roger. Always a pleasure. You get me going.
Our thanks to David Lloyd. And if you've been enjoying this podcast, please do support us. It will cost you less than a cup of coffee a month. You could do this by either a one-off payment on our crowdfunding page or regularly by signing up to patreon.com/BeebWatch for £1.99 per month. And by signing up to Patreon, this will also enable you to have my weekly blog, which gives my take on the week's interview. The link to this and our crowdfunding page can be found in the description of this programme. And that's it for this week. As you probably know, this podcast is presented by me, Roger Bolton, and it's produced by Kate Dixon. The sound is by Dave Kitto, and special thanks to Quinn Genti. It's a Good Egg production. Until next time, goodbye.